around the world.
Good evening, everybody. This is Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here at WCNC. Today is November 30th. It's the last day of November. It's also the last day of meteorological fall, but it's also, more importantly, for a lot of folks who sweat this out all summer and early fall long, the end of the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season. There's a look at the chart. You can see the season climatologically starts on June 1st. Every year. Again, you can have storms before and after the season, but you could see the bulk of the storms happen between June 1st and November 30th. The peak day was back on September 10th, so a lot of the season is always backloaded, but November 30th is the last day. We have had a few storms actually after this date, but you're more likely going to see storms before June 1st now. We've seen more storms in May and even April now than we have in the last couple of decades. There's far fewer late in the season. You tend to get more nor'easters or subtropical systems. Let's look back, though. I think it's always important to look back at the forecast for the hurricane season. We were in El Nino this year. Now, typically, El Nino summers tend to increase wind shear in the Atlantic, and that normally deters storms. But this year, the forecast was for above average. Actually, after the update in the middle of the summer, they went from 15 to 18. You can see our average number of storms in the Atlantic Basin is now 14 named storms, 7 of those becoming hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So what happened this year? Well, I'm going to show you the list of names because it was pretty evident we were going to have a lot of storms this year. We ended up with 20 storms, one unnamed storm, by the way, which happened back in January. But you can see from Arlene all the way down to Tammy, we almost had Vince there. I crossed out Vince just because I wanted to show you we had 20 storms. Vince technically didn't get a name, or even Arlene, but there was a storm back in January, kind of a unique setup that occurred. Like I mentioned, you can have storms earlier before the start of the season. Back in January, there was a nor'easter off the East Coast that about 3 months later, the Hurricane Center went back and looked at the data and found that it was a subtropical storm. Those do get named, so it was actually considered a subtropical system. Let's look at the tracks, though. Now, this was an interesting season. So we had 20 storms, right? More than average. But look where all of them were. Out in the middle of the Atlantic, the Central Atlantic, the Eastern Caribbean, a lot of them in the Central Atlantic and off the East Coast. In fact, if we show you the stats here, you can see 20 storms, 19 of them named, but only 3 U.S. landfalls. Now, I had someone on Facebook tonight say, hey, what about Hillary on the West Coast? Remember, this is the Atlantic season. We're not talking about the Pacific, though technically Hillary did not make landfall as a hurricane on the West Coast. But the Pacific season is completely different. That season actually starts on May 15th, so it actually starts earlier, and we don't really tend to see any tropical systems in the Pacific make landfall in the U.S. unless they go all the way to the Central Pacific and make landfalls in Hawaii. But those systems were all out in the middle of the Atlantic. Let's talk about the 3 systems there, though, that did impact Texas, Florida, and obviously the Carolinas. It seems like we can never go a season without a system affecting the Carolinas. What's interesting about this pattern, though, as we zoom in on the United States, a lot of folks will ask, well, why did we have so many storms out here and none of them impact us? Remember, late summer into the early fall, we were in a drought. Part of the reason we were in a drought, and we're still in it actually right now, was we had a big high pressure system park over the southeast. That kept everything off to the east or the south and primarily blocked everything from coming into the U.S. Typically late in the summer and into the fall, at the end of the hurricane season towards the peak, we tend to have what's called the Bermuda High. That little speck on the map, that's the island of Bermuda. High pressure is parked right there. It's clockwise flow like this, and we tend to get troughs coming down over the East Coast. So that tends to steer things either like this or steer things into the East Coast, or occasionally, depending on the position of the trough and the high, steer them towards Florida. This year, the high was actually parked right here, and that forced everything to go off to the east. So you ended up with a very active season in the middle of the Atlantic. So why did we have so many storms, even though they didn't impact the United States in an El Nino year? I talked about the wind shear. Well, even though we had a lack of wind shear, we had tons of warm water. In fact, this is a current look. I'm going to pause it right here so I can move the map. This is actually a current look at the sea surface temperatures as of today, the end of November. All of the orange and red is above average sea surface temperature. Basically, the water was boiling hot. Remember this summer, we were talking about mid and upper 90-degree temperatures off the coast of Florida. That warm water was enough to get storms to get going, even though we had some wind shear. And at times, the wind shear is going to calm down. And during an El Nino type summer like this, you're not going to have wind shear the whole time. So when the wind shear even let up a little bit, we had every single tropical wave kind of explode over this warm water. You also see on this map, which I think is pretty cool, you actually see the El Nino pattern. El Nino means warmer than average water in the eastern equatorial Pacific, and there it is. See all that warm water near the equator and then the eastern Pacific? That is a classic signature of El Nino. Now, that's going to impact our upcoming winter. Now that hurricane season is over, this warm water is going to have a big impact on our winter season, because with all this warm water off the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, that can fuel storms. And I'm talking about low pressure systems tracking across the southern part of the country. And that's why for our winter forecast, we were going with above average precipitation and maybe slightly to near average, slightly below, I should say, to near average temperature. So again, to recap, we'll go back to the season. The most powerful storm to impact the United States was Idalia right there, which actually impacted the Florida Panhandle. We'll zoom in on that one real quickly just to show you that track. That was our most powerful storm to impact. You can see that track, category 5, then 4, or excuse me, 4 to 5, then back to a 4. That was a very powerful storm that went through the Panhandle. It eventually moved up here, and we didn't see many impacts from it here because it weakened quite dramatically and then passed off to the south. So we didn't see much up in the Charlotte area, but Myrtle Beach did see a pretty big storm surge. I think it was the 3rd highest on average there at the Spring-Made Pier. And then this storm was early in the season, which actually only caused a little bit of rain and a little bit of wind. So overall, we were very lucky in the Carolinas from any significant storms. But part of the problem with this season, not seeing many storms even steer towards us, actually helped produce the drought. As I mentioned, that high pressure system parked over the southeast was a big driver to keep the storms away from us, but it also kept the rainfall away. The thing about tropical systems here in the Carolinas, while we don't want to see big powerful storms and hurricanes, we like to see weaker ones or the remnants get in here, because that moisture tends to give us a lot of our late summer and early fall rainfall. Typically, it's somewhere on the order of 20 to 25% of our annual rainfall, believe it or not, comes from tropical systems. And when we don't have those, we tend to see a drought. Now, we can make up for that if we get storm systems and cold fronts, but with that high pressure parked over us, not only did it steer away all of the tropical systems and hurricanes, it also steered away the cold fronts and low pressure systems that bring us rain, and it shut off all of that warm, humid air to come in for any of those systems. So we ended up not seeing much in the way of moisture moving up here into the Carolinas, and it really kept just about everything away from us. Now, the current temperatures out there, I want to show you quickly those temperatures in the Atlantic just to give you an idea on what they look like. We'll actually put some numbers on there. And just to show you, here we are going into the beginning of December. There's Bermuda right there. And off the East Coast, obviously we have the Gulf Stream there. A lot of those temperatures are actually sitting. And actually pause this again so we can kind of see where we are here. We'll advance that a little bit and zoom in. So you can see the surface waters near the coast are cooler, 50s and 60s, but boy, you know, if we had a low pressure system, a nor'easter that moved over the Gulf Stream right now, there's enough warm water there with 76 degree water, 74. That's pretty close to 80 degrees. Typically about 78 degree water is enough to sustain a tropical or subtropical system. So I wouldn't write it off that we couldn't see a late season storm that could have similar type characteristics to a tropical or subtropical system, because with the El Nino storm track coming through here, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something try to spin up here in December. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. And even going into next year, that'll be an interesting setup to see that warm water. And just to show you where that water is being fed from, down here in the Caribbean, look at that. We still got water temperatures in the mid 80s. So this time of year, if you don't like the cold temperatures, this is kind of the place to go. The real thing to watch this winter will be how much cooling occurs here, because part of the reason that it was so warm in the tropical Atlantic this year was we had such a mild winter last year and nothing was able to cool off in the Atlantic, even the Gulf of Mexico and off the East Coast. Remember, we had the cold snap in December and then super warm in January, February, and that kind of set the stage for all of the warm water out here in the Atlantic, which really led to all those storms. So let's go back to the season, because I like looking at this graphic just to kind of show you. It's not a spaghetti plot. These are the actual tracks of all 20 storms that occurred this year. And you can see a lot of the genesis, or the beginning of these storms, was off the coast of Africa. That's the one thing that was kind of interesting about this year. Typically, we would see a lot more development closer to home. And that's probably what helped these storms maintain themselves, because in El Nino, the wind shear is usually stronger here than it is here. So the fact that they all formed here, and some of them actually formed pretty close to the African coast, those are the Cape Verde Islands. Actually, they've got a new name, and sometimes we refer to these Cape Verde storms, the ones that are the long track, but they also have the most opportunities to recurve into the central Atlantic. So season's over for now. We got pretty lucky this year, knock on my plastic right here, that the Carolinas were not impacted by any devastating storms. Next year will be interesting. Will we still have El Nino? Will La Nina transition back, or will it be a neutral year? So we'll have to see what happens through the winter and spring, and we'll probably get the first hurricane season outlooks. They typically come out at the beginning of April from Colorado State. Even we'll get one from NC State about the same time. So look for those to come out at the end of winter, early spring next year. And the big driving force will be what happens with El Nino out in the Pacific. If it's still strong, which we think it'll be, could be another year very similar to this. Again, the end of hurricane season today. Thanks for joining us. Now we turn our attention to winter weather and nor'easters, which will be the big story going into the winter months.
Recently, Rick Starnes with Brothers Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing stopped by for a visit.
Saw the need that he had, his circumstances.
I thought he had come to talk to me about one of the estimates that I had got to buy a unit.
Little did Lonnie know, his name was submitted in the Brothers and ARS Cares Community Heroes program, in which a new heating and cooling system is installed to a deserving community hero. And not long after Rick's visit, Lonnie found out he won